Salam, hello and welcome. Today I'm going to take apart the engine of this HSP Blue Rocket. I will dismantle the engine, service it and put it back together, and this will be more than one video. But it will be interesting for you guys to see. Let me take the cover out. And here's the inside of the car. It's a four-wheel drive car. Here's the front drive shaft, and here's the rear one. The rear one is a bit weird because it goes right through the fuel tank. Here's the reduction gear set. These are the brake disc and brake pads. So to take this engine, the engine is mounted to the car with these bolts right here holding it against the gear plate. And there are two bolts underneath mounting the engine to the chassis. Now, I already have emptied the fuel tank before I start working, so it's safe to flip the car over like so. And it will hold in place. Now, these are the two screws mounting the engine to the chassis. And these are 3mm hex screw. Now be aware of this, any screws holding the engine to the chassis of any RC car, it's always treated with Loctite, always. Keep that in mind when you remount the engine to the car. And just so you know, there is a spacer here that I will need to take and not to lose, it's very important. You can see that the engine is sitting on these two spacers, maintaining the distance between the engine and the chassis. And I'll meet you on the other side. I figured it will be easier to use this T-wrench. Now, before I continue, I will do two things. I will break the spark plug loose, so I don't struggle with it when I take the engine out. It's much easier to break it loose when it's on the car. And I will also have to take the two screws of the exhaust out. Now, to break the spark plug, you will need a 16mm socket. And it is loose. Yes. I will keep the spark plug in its place right now, so the engine is still covered and protected against any dust. The screws mounting the exhaust with the engine are 4mm, hex drive of course. Almost every screw on this car is hex drive. I will get them loose before I take any one of them out. Now, when you deal with hex screws, always ensure that the screwdriver is fully seated inside. Otherwise, you will strip the screws and you will ruin your driver, and screws stripped in such locations are just pain in the neck. You don't want that, believe me. I've been there few times. Here comes one. The three screws holding the clutch case of the engine with the gear plate are 5mm, so I'll use this T-wrench to break them loose. And three. I'll have to do two things. One is to disconnect the throttle link with the servo, and two is to disconnect the fuel lines This is the feed line, the lower one is the feed line, and the upper one is the return line. The best way, in my opinion, to disconnect the throttle link is that I will disconnect the servo arm, and then I will have much leverage to move the throttle link and slide it out. Now, here's a tip for you. Whenever you take a servo arm out, always have it in straight orientation, so you don't struggle when you reinstall it. You don't need to readjust when you reinstall it. You just put it back in straight orientation, and there will be no adjustments required. So let's take the fuel lines out. And now the engine is out. I'm going to take the flywheel cover, which is this big aluminum cover, out. The top screws are Phillips screws. All other screws holding the cover to the engine, which they are 2 on this side and 2 on this side, are hex 4mm. Actually, the top 2 Phillips screws are attaching this cover with this cover. I like this magnetic tray. It keeps screws in place. If your pull starter is good and working fine, you don't need to take it out. It still can be attached to the cover. I'm going to need both hands to do this. And now the cover should come off. Broken part from the crankcase. And I wonder how it got broken. Not sure how. Anyway, I'm going to keep it. This car is an on-road car, not off-road car, and it doesn't take much of beating. And now I'll take the upper cover, the plastic one, out. Now I'll take the air filter out. To take the carburetor off the isolator, that's why I kept this plastic cover, because dirt is coming out the engine from almost everywhere. The engine has good compression. Actually, there was nothing wrong with this engine when I decided to take it apart, except for it has been running for a few years now, and I'm curious to see how it looks from inside. Now, taking a closer look, it seems like I'm having an intake leak here from the gasket. I can see traces of some leak, and there is a small or slight leak here also from the head gasket. And that's why it's important to check the engine every once in a while, so you can be aware of such abnormalities and treat them. And that's how the piston goes up and down inside the cylinder. Now you see in the piston from the exhaust port, just took the bits of the exhaust gasket out. Now before reinstallation, I'll have to clean this. Any mating surface should be clean and ready to accommodate a new gasket. The carburetor is not mounted straight to the engine. In between, there is this plastic piece here, which is called isolator block. And it forms like an intake manifold. So the 2 screws holding the carburetor are 4mm, and they are fairly long screws. Actually, you know, this engine, it's so popular, and it runs on a variety of RC cars. You'll find the same engine on HPI Bajas, all of FG cars, HSP, Harm, MCD 1/5 scale. This is the engine that's usually used on any 1/5 scale car. And this engine comes in variety of sizes. For example, when I first bought the HSP, it had a 23cc engine on it. The 23cc is gutless. It has almost no power. The most two popular sizes are 26. The 26cc usually comes with 34 piston, and it comes with a stock stroke for the crankshaft, and that's 28 The 29.5cc, the piston size is bigger, it's 36 and the stroke is plus 1 that makes it 29 millimeters stroke. The 30.5cc comes with the same size of piston at 36 millimeters. The stroke is plus 2 that makes total stroke range of 30 millimeters. Here's the carburetor with the intake. And the carburetor looks good, just needs a little bit of cleaning. The outside of it is a bit dusty and dirty. Now, because there is an intake leak here, and I can see the traces are obvious, so I'll take the isolator block out. When the assembly time comes, I will install a new gasket here. The screws holding the isolator block, they are also 4 Now actually the screw is loose, so the gasket might be fine. The screw was completely loose, and this one is not too tight either. Now these screws usually are mounted with thread locks, so it's possible that this one did not take enough quantity of Loctite. If you think you are going to get confused with the screws and you will not know which goes where, it's a good idea to keep them in bags and tag them. So you write on the back from the outside where these screws are, what they are for. And the gasket is not torn, it's actually a Teflon gasket. It seems that the isolator block was not mounted properly. The screw was not tight. Let me give it a bit of cleaning. After cleaning. Now this is a Teflon gasket, and Teflon gaskets are safe to use multiple times. So I'm going to keep this one and I will reuse it. It's not really a good idea to have an intake leak. What that means is your engine sucking air that's not counted by the carburetor, and the end result will be a lean fuel mix, and that usually cause overheat problems. Now most of the piston seizure issues, they are a result of lean conditions. My next step or next move will be taking the flywheel out and then taking the clutch out, so that the crank is free. When I split the two cases here, the two parts of the crankcase, I can take the crank out easily. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the ignition coil. The ignition coil is mounted with 2 screws to the cylinder head, and these are 3 hex screws. And here's the ignition coil. I'm going to keep the screws in. I'm doing the same with the intake manifold, so I'm keeping the screws in so I know that these screws belong to this part. Now is the time to take the spark plug out. And that is how the spark plug looks. It's too dark, but at least it's dry. This shows that the mix was. Now next I'm going to take out the flywheel, which is on this side, and then I'm going to take out the clutch. In order to be able to take out the flywheel and the clutch, I'll have to apply a piston stopper, because as I'm trying to take the nut out, the flywheel will keep rotating. What the piston stopper do is it holds the piston in place and it prevents any movement. And to achieve that, I'm going to use this piston stopper. This is a multiple size piston stopper, so it's used for larger spark plugs and the smaller ones, which is the size of this engine. So I'll remove this part and then I'll plug the stopper in. Right, that's it. The nut that's holding the flywheel is 12 millimeters, and for that I'm going to use a 12 millimeters nut socket with a ratchet. And here's the nut. Now, you will find that the flywheel is stuck in its place, it wouldn't move. And there is a special tool to take the flywheel out. Now, this is the flywheel puller, and the way it works, that the two screws on the side, they get mounted to the flywheel, and then the center screw pushes against the crankshaft, making the flywheel to be pulled away from the crankshaft. Now, this usually comes with most of the RC cars that's using this particular engine. For example, it comes with HPI Baja. I don't think it comes with FG, and I don't think it comes with the HSP or MCD. But anyway, this is available on eBay and Amazon if you really need it. You can also check your local hobby shop. Most of them, they sell such tools. And the screws on the flywheel are 5mm hex. And this is enough. And now, as I start to tie the screw clockwise, it will pull the flywheel out. It's very important to make sure that the screw is seated on the crankshaft. And here we go. Here's the flywheel, and look at the dust falling from the flywheel. I will be cleaning all of these parts before I put them back together. Now, a very important bit, on the crankshaft you will find a little piece, which is this one, and this is called the woodruff key. It ensures that the flywheel does not slip on the crankshaft as the crankshaft rotates. So it always maintains the flywheel stuck in a certain position in order to ensure proper timing for the ignition. Don't lose this bit. Always keep it in somewhere safe. Now I'm going to take the clutch out. The clutch is mounted with two screws, and the size of these screws are 14mm. I'm going to keep with the washers with the clutch screws so I don't lose them. Next, I'm going to remove the clutch holder, which in this case bolted with a 10mm screw. In most of the engines, this comes with hex screw, 4 or 5mm, I can't remember exactly, but in most engines it comes with the hex. In this particular case, it's 10mm screw. Now, if the clutch holder doesn't come out right away, give it a few taps with the plastic hammer or rubber hammer. That didn't work quite well. I'm going to try something else. I'm going to try to see if I can take it with the flywheel puller. It should be easier to give it taps from here. Now what I'm going to try, because tapping on the rubber hammer did not work, I'm going to try to use a vice grip pliers and apply some pressure on it. Try to twist it. Now that eventually worked. Now this engine is ready to be taken apart. I'm going to clean it a bit with wet wipes. I could clean it with brake clean, but here's the issue. There are two rubber seals here and here. And if they come in contact with brake clean, then the rubber will be no good. So I'll do this cleaning when I take the clutch case out, and then I'll soak it in brake clean. The screws holding the clutch case in place are 4 mm hex. And they are 4 screws. And because they are very tight, I highly recommend using a T-wrench. I mean, these screws usually are treated with Loctite. Any screws bolted to the engine directly is treated with Loctite. In fact, the only screws which are not treated with Loctite on this engine are the cover screws, the outer cover and the pull starter. Other than that, every screw here is with Loctite, with exception to the clutch screw. This one does not need to be Loctite. It gets tight by itself. Okay, looking at this, the oil seal seems to be okay on this side. There is only dust, but there is no muddy dust. There is no oil leak. And so on this side. Okay, and now we come to the part where we remove the cylinder head. The cylinder head in this particular engine is mounted with 4 screws. And each of these screws is 4 mm hex. Now, some of the older model engines, they come with 2 screws only, one on this side and one on that side. Definitely having 4 screws is better. Using one of those engines, I had the head broken with me one time. It was a ported, powerful engine, and the 2 screws could not take all that compression. So the cylinder walls broke. And yes, if you are curious about the brand of the engine, this is Zenowa. Zenowa is a Japanese brand that's a subsidiary of Komatsu, and they've been doing these engines long time ago. This is actually a chainsaw engine. That's where it started. And it ended up being modified on several stages, and now it's powering very fast RC cars. Very interesting. Now the screws are starting to become a little too many, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep them in plastic bags, and I will tag these bags. So these 4 screws, they belong to the clutch case. I'll have them here, and here I'm going to write clutch case, so they don't get mixed up. Okay, now that all the screws are loose, the head is coming out. Before going any further, I'll just keep the screws in the bag. Okay, these 2 doesn't want to come out, so it's fine. It's fine. They don't want to come out, I'll keep them there. The inner cylinder walls of the cylinder head looks fine. Actually, the head itself looks clean. It doesn't look bad. There is almost no carbon deposit there. Well, there is some, but not by much. You can see the port job that has been done to the transfer ports right here. And it's similar story on the other side, right here. Usually when any engine or cylinder head is ported, also the exhaust port is enlarged and polished, and the intake manifold is enlarged a bit as well. Now this is the piston. It has some carbon deposits, but not by much. That's not bad at all. And here's the piston ring. Now, a good test to do is testing your crank to see if there's any play. Pull the crank from side to side, like so, because this will help you knowing if there's any problem with the bearings, with the crank bearings. To separate the piston from the crankshaft, the piston is mounted with a wrist pin. The wrist pin is holding the piston together with the connecting rod of the crankshaft. Now, to release the wrist pin, which is located here on this side, and then on the other side as well, you can access that. There are small C-clips in grooves inside here. Once you remove the C-clips, then you will gain access to the rest pin. And to remove the C-clips, I'll use a small flat screwdriver. But I will be very careful because these C-clips, when they come out, they have tendency to jump across the room. But also as I'm working this, I'm being very careful not to scratch the piston. Okay, I'm going to try holding it with the pliers and pull it out using these pliers. Just as I expected, it did jump and fly away somewhere, and I cannot see it. It is officially lost. But that means that I can release the piston. And to remove the piston, I only need to remove one spare clip. I don't need to remove both of them. Here is the rest pin starting to come out. This is the rest pin. This is the piston. These are the thrust washers. And in such case, when you take the thrust washers, it's very important to maintain the orientation and the sides that they were installed in, if you are going to install the same washers again. So for example, this one is on the clutch side, and I'm going to leave a mark on it. So when I'm coming to installation time, I know that the marked one is the clutch side washer. And also, I'll take the needle bearing. These needle bearings mostly remain in good condition. Yeah, like this one, that is still in good condition. The last set of screws on this engine is the crankcase screws, and that's 4 of them, 4 mm each. Before I split the 2 halves of the crankcase, I'll remove the cylinder head gasket. And this gasket is a steel graphite. I highly recommend not to use it, and I'll show you why. Because the graphite leaves such residues on the mating surface. Not only that, I have been through conditions where the graphite just was torn apart and the steel was there, and there was leaks from the areas where the graphite was torn apart. Here's one half of the crankcase. This is the bearing, the crank bearing, and here's the oil seal on the other side. This is the crankshaft, and if you can see, it says plus 1 mm stroker. Now I can feel that there's a little play here with the connecting rod, but that's not bad. This engine can handle such play. In fact, I've seen it in situations where it handled worse than this play. Now what I want to do is I want to test the bearings for any play, and to do that I'll place the crank like so, and then I'll move it from side to side and see if there's any play. And there's hardly any. This bearing is good. I'm removing the crankcase gasket. And here it is. We'll be installing a new one. And this bearing is definitely good. There's no play whatsoever. Yeah, the crankcase bearings are good. I don't need to replace them. The seals are good as well, and I don't need to replace them. Now, I'm thankful for that, because replacing the crankcase bearings is not a very easy task. These are press fit. So to remove them, I'll need a press machine, and to fit a new one, I'll need a press machine, which I don't have, but I don't need to. And so this is how the engine looks like when it's taken in pieces. The 2 halves of the crankcase, ignition coil, crankshaft, clutch holder, clutch, flywheel, the piston, the rest pin with the needle bearing in it, and thrust washers, spark plug, isolator block or intake manifold, cylinder head, carburetor, clutch case, engine plastic cover, flywheel cover and pull starter, and this is the air filter. And I like to keep outer wears on all the air filters, whether they are fabric or foam. It just keeps the dust away. Now, I hope this video was useful for you guys. And for sure now you know how to take your engine apart, whether it's for servicing, parts replacement, for whatever reason you need to take it apart for. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, please give it thumbs up and like and share it with your friends. And if you are not subscribed yet, well, think about it. Consider subscribing. Thank you for watching. Take care, be safe, and do it yourself.